Hey, y'all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today I am going to talk to you about how a 47-year-old man named George Marquart, aka Squeak, became known as the Godfather of Fentanyl. So, let's talk about him. George Eric Marquart was born in Waukesha, Wisconsin on January 30th, 1946. His parents were George and Bunny, and after a break of 12 years, he was followed by two sisters, Jenny and Mary. His family called him Eric growing up, as he was a junior. His sisters said that they were a traditional family with a stay-at-home mom. George Sr. worked for Alloy Products, Inc., a manufacturing company that produced stainless steel pressure vessels, tanks, and other equipment for the food, packing, and chemical industries. They lived in a corner house with their grandparents living right next door. Eric was intelligent, putting together electrical circuits at a pretty young age. Eric says that in his early age he, quote, started fooling around with chemistry, end quote. His sisters both say his passion was chemistry, and their parents liked to indulge his curiosities. Eric also says of this time that he was a happy child up until 4 when he developed a strangulated hernia. The surgery at this time had a fairly high mortality rate, and his parents were supposedly told that it was better not to tell Eric much about what was going on. They were also told that there were no parental visits during the hospital stay. He was left in the hospital without family for his 2-week recovery. The doctors were adamant he would forget the ordeal, but he did not. And this, according to him, taught him not to trust anyone, even his own parents, or those with doctorates and PhDs, as they meant nothing. So this once happy-go-lucky kid became more isolated and subdued. His sister said that he was a weird kid growing up. He hated school and formal education. He hated school from the beginning. In kindergarten, he was asking his teacher about Newton's law and was already proficient in math. But still, he failed because he wouldn't skip. Eric said that it wasn't that he couldn't skip, he just didn't see the point in it, so he didn't do it. His parents pushed back, and he didn't have to reattend kindergarten. He went straight to first grade. But this set the tone for his years. Throughout elementary, he continued to be bored and more of a problem for teachers than they knew what to do with. By 11, he reached a boiling point, and during one confrontation with a teacher, lit a trash can on fire. The result of this was going to boys' school. At age 12, his aunt asked him if he could make a good moonshine. And after acquiring a book that said about explaining the basics of everything, he got to work. He used molasses out of Briar Rabbit for the sugar content, and then refilled those bottles with 150 proof alcohol and sold it as Green Bunny. He amassed a following and carried it out for about 5 years. At 13, on May 10th, 1959, he went to the university lecture to a nearby school. Dr. Oppenheimer of the Manhattan Project spoke, and anyone was able to attend. So Eric decided to go. Eric said that after the lecture was opened up to discussion and questions, and he ended up speaking personally with Dr. Oppenheimer until almost 3 a.m. By the time he was in high school, at 14, he was bored in classes and was brought to college. There, he was taught how to methodically search for literature of chemistry in the library. At this time, he also began forming weird relationships, and by weird I mean pretty inappropriate. First, school required him to see a psychologist, and this man was sympathetic to the intelligence of Eric. He loaned him books and signed him passes to get him out of school. This wasn't the inappropriate one. This was just weird. The inappropriate relationship was that he was friends with their family's doctor, also the local coroner. The doctor had keys to the building of Rest Haven, an abandoned veterans hospital. and the doctor also had a drug habit. He had him making heroin in the abandoned building using the chemicals he used as part of being a coroner. Eric said he had a lot of fun learning and making heroin at this time. He would feel euphoric and realized that this is what got people addicted, this feeling of euphoria. The first time he did it, he got old bottles from a local drugstore. This store didn't throw anything away, and he was able to make 3 ounces of heroin. After this, and through more reading, the second batch was made with the bane and that the doctor had. After this, they used Tylenol with codeine, and for approximately a year, this was how Eric made heroin for his doctor. In 1962, Eric started pillaging the Milwaukee County General Hospital. In the basement, he found boxes of empty bottles as well as gallon jugs of Robitussin AC cough syrup just sitting on the shelves. AC here stands for with codeine. To sell it, he partnered with a man named Frank, and the venture was successful until Frank got caught unrelated with some stolen outboard motors. After that, this part of the venture was over. Then, on May 1st, 1964, Eric attended the state science fair. The next day, he was expelled by his high school for non-attendance. According to John Mattinger, quote, "He was truly a remarkable character, a very interesting guy. Completely self-taught, he was kicked out of high school for chronic truancy the same week he won the Wisconsin State Fair." End quote. Immediately after Eric got his first job at Marquette University in Milwaukee. At this time, he also got into creating LSD after learning that it was popular and people were paying good money for it. In order to get the equipment he needed to make LSD, he would steal the necessary lab equipment, particularly glassware, from the university. Eric said he was a one-man epidemic, but he was caught and jailed. Then at age 19, in April 1965, Eric was arrested for robbing the University of Wisconsin chemical department stockrooms, supplies he was using to get back into making LSD. A month later, on May 28, 1965, he married a student at UW in a shotgun-style wedding. She was 2 months pregnant. To make money, he sold the equipment that he had stolen from UW. But once UW realized their losses were between $5,000 and $15,000, they made a formal complaint and a bench warrant was obtained. The couple was in Los Angeles when Eric was arrested at Conrad Hilton Hotel on June 10th. While Eric pleaded guilty, his new bride petitioned for an annulment. Eric received probation for the stolen equipment, and his bride received said annulment. In 1966, he was working as a lab assistant when he learned that the facility was going to offload their mass spectrometer as well as other equipment. Nearby Alverno College, a Roman Catholic school, was attempting to squeeze their budget, and Sister Mary Emilius put out an advert asking for lecturers. Eric, seeing this, realized he could use it to his advantage. The mass spectrometer had to go to a facility, and not a single person, he had learned after making an inquiry. And here is this college asking for help. So he struck a deal, introducing Sister Mary to the lab, who then gave them the donated equipment, sans mass spectrometer that Eric managed to keep for himself. But as part of the deal, he became a lecturer. Sister Mary even sat on the first few and was impressed by his knowledge. But after a few lectures, he failed to appear, and after a few calls, Sister Mary learned that Eric hadn't even graduated high school. For this fraud, he was given a year and a day in federal prison to run concurrently with another 4-year sentence he received from the state for the theft of the UW oscilloscope caper. Eric was sent to the Wisconsin State Reformatory at Green Bay. This is where he was taught how to serve time appropriately. After being assessed as a low-level inmate, he was sent to Fox Lake, a medium security facility, and from there he moved to a minimum security camp at the former U.S. Air Force Station at Williams Bay. There, he could come and go to find employment. He was also able to set up an LSD manufacturing site just off the correctional grounds, something that made him popular amongst his cohort. In February of 1969, he was released and sent back to his hometown. In 1970, he was sent home for the last, or he left home for the last time, according to his sisters. That's when his parents said he couldn't bring drugs around them. At the end of the summer, when his sisters and his parents were away for a wedding, Eric stole their father's car and left. It broke down in Chicago, and Eric simply abandoned it. He never spoke to his parents again. According to Eric, he saw no future there and wanted freedom and to be adventurous. He says that he was going around the country at this time, and while he was creating LSD, it was a rather sporadic demand, and he wanted something more stable, something that had constant demand. Eric traveled to Oklahoma State University at this time, where he stole a reactor control and counting equipment for a disused shutdown reactor. In Indiana, to make money, he installed two-way radios for a man. But when he wasn't paid, he took the radios and the man's truck and fled. He was stopped in Illinois, and Indiana found out and charged him with auto theft, sentencing him to 1 to 10 years. He served just under 1 and was picked up immediately by Oklahoma after his release. On May 19, 1971, he was charged for the theft of the university's equipment. He was given 2 years and sent to Oklahoma State Penitentiary, and again he released in September of 1972. On June 6, 1973, he was arrested in Galena, Illinois for possession of stolen items. The items were from Denver, Kansas, and the University of Michigan. All 3 states wanted their pound of flesh, and as a result, he moved between states, ending in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There, he received 2 to 10 years at Marquette Branch Prison. At this time, they had a dairy farm, and while he was there, he ended up being helpful when a milking machine burned up. As a result, he was given more freedom. He was then released on March 12, 1975. After 6 months in a halfway house, Eric finished his time in Michigan, and in late 1975, he left, making it to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. There, meth was becoming huge. Oil workers wanted to work extended periods, and meth was cheaper than cocaine. So drugs grew. He met with Robert Harris, who wanted him to make meth, and that a biker gang, the Pagans, had money and were willing to pay for it. According to Eric, his consumers considered him the best, and he'd pack the meth in coffee-mate jars for transport. But Robert started taking product to feed his own drug addiction. And once, when Eric left for a weekend, when he returned, Robert took all of his cooking supplies. Eric took this as a personal slight, so he made a phone call to Jimmy Birdsong in the Oklahoma Office of Narcotics. As a result, Robert was caught cooking meth in his own backyard. It was the largest lab bust to date. In order to become a state's witness, Eric also agreed to be an informant as long as he got immunity for his past crimes. As part of this, he meets John Mattinger, who was a narcotics agent at the time. He was an informant for a while, but states that it was complicated because part of the time he was still cooking. So he decided to skip town, moving to the Pacific Northwest. There, he started cooking in Seattle, and soon enough people realized that he was in Seattle due to the caliber of meth that was coming out of the area. From there, he traveled to Spokane, where he decided to get an RV. He would cook, then travel, and joked that it was Breaking Bad style, making it difficult to be found. By 1977, Eric had returned to Oklahoma. The Faribault Daily News published on October 29, 1977, Rice County deputies' investigation began when a 31-year-old man from Oklahoma rolled his car over on a county road in Wells Township. While the man had no identification at the time, it is now believed he was Eric. Quote, a search of the car turned up a quantity of sodium cyanide, a poisonous gas. Meanwhile, the resort owner at Roberts Lake had told deputies that an odd character was staying in a cabin, that he and his money smelled of offensive chemicals. The tenant was from Oklahoma. Deputies learned that the man was in the hospital, was also from Oklahoma, and that he was staying at the Lindale Motel with a woman from Oklahoma. End quote. There, an Agent Henderson just happened to see him get on the phone in Oklahoma City. When Eric got in his car, the agent followed him, all the way down to a small town called Beggs. Narcotics agents surveilled him 24/7. Two undercover agents, Lonnie Wright and Lane Dodd, were sent to the house to see if they could smell any phenylacetic acid, the main chemical compound in cooking meth. Well, they weren't allowed in, they smelled it, and so a warrant was obtained. On January 17, 1978, the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics, which was the next morning, delivered this warrant to the door, which Eric answered with a gas mask on. He invited the officers in and gave them a tour of the lab. Eric states he didn't want to give them too much, but he also didn't want anyone handling the chemicals to get themselves injured. In one room, he was cooking meth. In a second, he was creating 2,4,5-trimethoxyamphetamine, the effects of which were similar to meth plus LSD. On February 3rd, 1978, a newspaper reported that the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics arrested Eric while he was making a new drug. Eric is transferred to Muskogee, and he pleaded guilty. He also told the judge and the agents in the courts that he'd do it again, that he liked to make drugs. Judge Morris, as a result, gave him 10 years in federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, this is the same place that most top-level mobsters were serving time, all in J Block, the same place Eric went. Eric said he was well known in the population, and Louis Cirillo, a heroin kingpin, was housed next to him. Cirillo would kill people he dealt with, according to Eric. One day, in 1981, Cirillo took Eric to his cell to talk about drugs. He was fascinated by the new drugs that could replace heroin, handing over an article with the name of a new drug, fentanyl. Fentanyl was created by Janssen Pharmaceuticals as a painkiller that is a rapid onset drug with a quick recovery time. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, not plant-based, and by 1980s it was a common surgical drug. It still is. First synthesized in Belgium in the 1950s, it was brought into medical use within 10 years and is typically used for cancer patients with chronic pain. The drug is around 100 times more potent than morphine, with 100 micrograms of fentanyl approximately equivalent to 10 milligrams of morphine and 75 milligrams of pethidine. The odorless clear liquid, which can also come in a white crystalline powder form, is typically prescribed in patches. When taken illegally, it is often intravenously, smoked, or snorted. According to the Food and Drug Administration, for patients who are not opioid tolerant, the amount of fentanyl in one fentanyl patch of the lowest strength is large enough to cause dangerous side effects such as severe trouble breathing, very slow or shallow breathing, and even death. Historically, it has been used to treat breakthrough pain and is commonly used in pre-procedures as a pain reliever as well as an anesthetic in combination with a benzodiazepine. A painkiller patch is prescribed for patients who are in severe, chronic, and have already developed a resistance to narcotic drugs. Cancer patients, again, are sometimes prescribed the painkiller patch because of the extreme pain often associated with the disease. Certain brands of the drug, including Jurassic by Primacare, among others, have been recalled in the past because of a defect in the patches that could result in even accustomed patients to overdosing and dying. Cirillo wanted Eric to make it for street use, But due to Cirilla's reputation being dangerous, Eric said that he wasn't interested, and Cirilla simply assumed that this meant that he couldn't do it, not that he just wouldn't do it for him. In the spring of 1982, a new inmate entered Louisburg, Joseph Martier, the central figure in the largest PCP factory in the U.S. at the time. In him, Eric found a potential partner, and the two of them discussed fentanyl. The startup cost was a big part of this, however, and Eric needed a money man. Eric also said if they made it, quote, "we're going to kill a bunch of people," end quote. Joseph seemed fine with that. In 1984, Eric is released and returned to Oklahoma, and Joseph is transferred to Danbury Federal Prison in Danbury, Connecticut. Joseph there meets fellow inmate and previous lawyer who puts him in contact with a man named Moscatello, a man with the means to have money set up for them. And so, the judicial system unintentionally set Eric up to become this godfather of fentanyl. In 1989, Joseph gets out and immediately gets with Eric, telling him that a man named Christopher Moscatello has the funds. Previously, Christopher was in the marijuana business. But not just that, he was also involved with drug distribution with the Boston mob. True to his word, Christopher had the funding, and Eric flew to Boston to set up a fentanyl lab. Joseph created the TX Green front in order to buy glassware that they needed for cooking. TX Green was immediately flagged by a chemical company who called the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and in checking on the company, they found that TX Green was also buying other chemicals from other companies. The DEA consulted Jack Fasanello, a chemist with the DEA out of New York. Jack immediately said that there was a lab somewhere and it was going to be big due to the amounts of chemicals being purchased. So the DEA began to investigate TX Green further. Through it, they found that Joseph had a company making specialized glassware equipment, including beakers. The DEA learned of the pickup date and followed Joseph as he and his wife picked up the glassware. A month later, another TX Green employee was going to pick up a barrel of benzene. Christopher came in a Range Rover and picked it up. Surveillance followed him after, to Pembroke, Massachusetts. There, he realized he was being followed and managed to get away from his tail. For some unknown reason, the DEA case just simply closed within 2 weeks after this. But this spooked Christopher, and he was sure he was still being followed. Eric decided to use this as an opportunity to get the chemicals and glassware and drive back home to Wichita, Kansas in December of 1990. Using the literature that was presented by the company that produced fentanyl, Eric took apart the chemicals and information of reactions he found within the pages, ones that he knew would come from certain chemicals, and used this basic information to try and make his own street fentanyl. Eric says after weeks he made a discovery. In the heap of dirty glassware, he stumbled upon a small variant that, quote, got me tremendously excited, end quote. Quote, and then suddenly there was a heavy smoke that poured from the neck of the flask, and I held it up to the light, and I could just get a glint of crystals, beautiful white crystals. I was extremely excited, end quote. Then he continued, quote, then the most astonishing thing happened. This white powder fell down into the flask. It was immensely satisfying. I said, fuck yeah, I've got fentanyl, end quote. 2 months later, in January of 1991, Joseph takes the fentanyl to New York City, finding a dealer who agrees to dilute it and sell it on the street as new type of heroin. But this fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin, so if it's not diluted enough, it's deadly. Eric said he didn't know how strong it was because, again, he doesn't actually use drugs. But he is assured by this dealer that it can be cut. Still, the result is, quote, stiff city, end quote. On February 3rd, 1991, 6 people immediately died. Then the number grows to 12. Then hundreds are injured. It became national news and the DEA is once again involved. It was a crisis, and Eric was pissed, calling Joseph a stupid son of a bitch. The police labeled it as toxic heroin. Furthermore, it was found out that it was coming from, quote, Tango and Cash, end quote, heroin, a sample of which was found and sent to Jack in the DEA, and his analysis proved that it was actually fentanyl, not heroin. And while Eric wanted to cut back, police announced that Tango and Cash shouldn't be purchased, as it was a drug called fentanyl, which was more potent than heroin. In return, drug addicts went in search of the new drug to get that stronger high, which drove up the price of Tango and Cash. Realizing this, Christopher decides that he wants back in, saying that Eric owes him all this money for the original investment and bringing in the mob. So, Eric starts producing large quantities in order to pay off this supposed debt. Eric creates each batch in about 5 days. Then, Christopher would come to Kansas and pick it up and use the already established drug routes to supply this new drug. At the time, it was taped to the body of a person and flown back to the East Coast. After working for a while, Eric made all the precursors to the chemicals he needed. That way, he wasn't buying any more chemicals and the DEA wouldn't pay attention to him. Because of the high quality that was coming out, an official DEA chemist said that the only person that could do this needed to have at least a master's, and only they would be able to create this drug. As such, Eric wasn't really looked at as a mastermind. Again, he didn't even have a high school diploma. In the fall of 1991, Eric made multiple trips from his home to Boston. During one of these trips, Christopher said that he wanted Eric to make 25 pounds of 3-methylfentanyl, a drug that would be 60 times more potent than normal fentanyl. Eric said at this time he became suspicious of Christopher. After all, Christopher was involved with James Whitey Bulger, and Bulger dealt with the Murray brothers, Mike and Bill. They were involved with the IRA, which is the Irish Republican Army, and at this time there was a lot of bombings occurring in London from the IRA. This gave Eric pause for the 3-methylfentanyl, worrying that these people wanted to weaponize the already extremely dangerous drug. So Eric told Christopher it was extremely difficult to manufacture the variant of the drug he requested. In a stroke of luck, on August of 1992, the DEA was following a truck and it pulled over in a marijuana bust. 4 tons of marijuana was seized, and one of the movers was none other than Michael Murray of the Murray brothers. In order to lessen his sentence, Michael does what you're not supposed to. He becomes a rat. In it, he says he can help the fentanyl case. He informs them that Christopher Muscatella is the financier. This lines up with the case from years ago in which agents watched him pick up a barrel of benzene. They realize that this is real. He's providing legitimate information. So as part of the deal, agents require Michael to go in and set up a meeting with Christopher while wearing a wire. Christopher had told his sister that Michael Murray was his best friend at the time. And Michael tells Christopher that the heat on the fentanyl is too hot and they should start making pills for a while. Michael tells Christopher to have a chemist call a number that he had from a group that had a press they could use. In a few days, Joseph Martier calls the number speaking to a DEA agent. First, they talk about making quaaludes, and Joseph doesn't want to meet up, but instead wants to make the pills themselves, in which the agent asks if he knows how to bind the powder, do you know how to use the press, etc. Through the conversation, it is abundantly clear to the agent that Joseph was not the chemist. In the meantime, Joseph called Eric and said the operation offered to get a press to make pills. But Eric thinks this is bullshit. So, Michael Murray is instructed to go back to Christopher, saying that he has pressure being put on him. Christopher said that the actual chemist is a man named Squeak. After a search in their records, the DEA sees that Squeak is an alias for a man named George Eric Marquart. As Eric is still being pressured to make 3-methylfentanyl, he decided he needed a bigger lab at an industrial park. So he rented a warehouse and set it up as Prairie Lab. At this time, he's openly cooking fentanyl, but people in the area just assume that's part of this chemical company he works for. According to Eric, at this time, Joseph starts using, and during one of his visits to see Eric, Eric walked into his lab to find Joseph overdosing. While he just wanted to leave him, he knew his family was aware of where he was, and so Eric tried to resuscitate him. When that failed, he was forced to call 911 and save him. Later, Joseph asked, "Well, what happens now?" And Eric insinuated they ended up on the radar and will likely be caught very soon. In Boston, in November of 1992, DEA agents realized that Eric hasn't been in Oklahoma in years. So now they're on the hunt to find him. The DEA adds an undercover agent who they plant as a Colombian who wants to use their current heroin fentanyl route to add cocaine, giving them a cut of the earnings. In this way, they meet in December 5th of 1992 with Christopher. During the meeting, it was agreed that they would exchange fentanyl for cocaine, and when Christopher told him of the deal, Eric's hackles went up, so he started preparing to get caught. He made a lot of fentanyl and packed up money, hiding it away. On December 15th, the undercover agent and Christopher meet for a second time. And during the meeting, Christopher mentioned that you have to be careful because one of the assistants had recently overdosed in Wichita, Kansas. At the end of the meeting, the agent leaves with a tube filled with fentanyl. The next day, DEA agents fly out to the local Wichita office, meeting Barry Jameson. A quick glance and the agents could see a drug lab in the industrial park, and so the lab goes under 24/7 surveillance. Traveling from there to his home, Eric is watched. He's watched for weeks, until he's cooking again. Then the DEA coordinated arrests of Joseph, Christopher, and Eric at the same time. On February 3rd, 1993, the DEA arrests Eric as he leaves his home without incident and then moves in to take apart the lab. Eric states, quote, "I can't believe it took you this long," end quote. Once arrested, Eric has a conversation with the agents and basically tells them anything and everything they want to know. Joseph Martier is also arrested without incident. In Boston, a search warrant went out for Christopher Marscatello, but he's not home. Back in jail, another man walked by Eric and asked if he had a partner in Boston. Eric said yes, and the other man said, "Not anymore. He was killed." He was murdered in his rental car, shot twice in the back and once in the back of the head. Christopher's sister said that at the funeral, she met Michael Murray and the funeral director. She reported having an overwhelming feeling that Michael was the one who killed Christopher, but there was never any evidence as such or witnesses. Eric received 25 years for the manufacturing of fentanyl. Joseph received 30 years for his involvement. And as it turns out, Eric did make 3-methylfentanyl, but he was worried about what it could be used for, and so he stored it away. He added other chemicals and made it less potent than it could have been. It was later found in a storage facility and brought in for testing. It never made it to the market. In May of 2015, Eric received a compassionate release due to an aggressive cancer diagnosis. His sister Mary brought him home to Wisconsin. He did a series of interviews afterwards with John Mattinger. Then in August of 2017, he died of cancer. And with that, fentanyl stays off the streets for 20 years before it was reproduced by somebody, and now it is back and aggressively on the streets again. And with that, that is the end of The Godfather of Fentanyl. I hope you all enjoyed the story. And to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.